Okay, so this week you were reading about hydration and lots of issues that intersect with that. And there were some really interesting conversations and some themes that definitely came out of the reading conversations. So we're going to talk a little bit about when you're hydrated, how you know you're hydrated. We're going to talk about the different kinds of beverages that folks might choose if they're trying to rehydrate. And we'll also talk about caffeine because that came up a lot. And then I will talk a little bit about the concepts as they relate to lab, since your first lab is this weekend. So I thought I would start with a big overview of all the ways in which we regulate water balance in our bodies. Why am I having such a hard time making this square the right shape? So I brought this picture just to sort of think about all the different ways that water is coming in and out of our bodies. And some of these will come back to when we talk about metabolism. So if we imagine like all of the internal organs that are involved with water exchange inside of this box, and then like the outside world outside of it, all of these arrows are showing ways in which water comes in and out. So you read about most of these, right? So water can leave via sweat. We're also losing solutes via sweat. We lose water through our lungs. So when we do metabolism, we're taking sugars and converting them into CO2 and water, and then we exhale those things. So you actually lose a lot of water just by breathing. We bring water in, of course, through foods and through intentional drinking of water, and then we lose water through urine and through waste. So all of these things are tightly regulated, and you can see that at the center of this is blood vessels that are in the brain, and then also blood vessels that are in the heart and in the lungs. So this is all regulated at the neurologic level. So there are receptors in the brain, also receptors in the kidneys and the heart. And these things speak to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is this little organizing center in the brain that is really regulating lots and lots of points of homeostasis for the body. So if there's a set water level that your blood needs to be at for your optimum health, if the water drops above or below that, then there are things that trigger the hypothalamus to then respond by increasing feelings of thirst and other kinds of reactions. So if we get dehydrated and that water level drops low, then it might be that receptors in the kidneys will notice that the water level is low in the blood. There are receptors in the heart that can notice things like blood pressure and blood volume, and they can send messages to the hypothalamus to increase that feeling of thirst. And you also read about how it will cause release of ADH, or anti-diuretic hormone. And that means that the waters are going to, or your kidneys are going to hang on to more of that water, reabsorb more of that water to keep it in circulation instead of releasing it. And the opposite thing happens if your water level gets too high, that you're going to release less ADH, reabsorb less water to bring that level back down. So sort of what's the threshold for dehydration? How do you know if you're dehydrated? If you feel thirsty, then you're dehydrated. So there, hold on, I have information here. If you're thirsty, that means you're already dehydrated a little bit. So 1 or 2% water loss is enough to trigger the hypothalamus to initiate that thirst response. So by the time you feel thirsty, your water balance has already declined by a 1 or 2%. And that's already triggered your brain to bring it back up. The other things that can trigger that dehydration response are consuming a lot of salt. So a few folks talked about the idea that salty food makes them feel bloated, and it might make them feel extra thirsty. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second. I brought you this little slide because one of the things that a lot of folks use to measure their hydration status is urine color. And because dehydration affects both urination and defecation because of the way that it affects water balance. So if we have ADH, that anti-diuretic hormone, it's going to help retain water, and that urine output will become more concentrated. And so that means if you have like a really darkly colored urine, that likely means that your anti-diuretic hormone is high and you're retaining a lot of water. Because you're a little bit dehydrated. This can also lead to constipation because just like last week, we talked about how water absorption is happening through the large intestine, and that journey through the organ will determine the consistency of the feces. And the intestines can also increase their water absorption because they're a site of a really important water absorption. If you're dehydrated, your intestines will also be pulling more water out. And so that can cause constipation. There was a statement in the book that said that water doesn't fill you up. So I also wanted to clarify that for a moment. So when you drink a big glass of water, there are multiple levels on which your body is recognizing that you've done something. So your stomach will stretch anytime you've put a bunch of stuff in your stomach. So whether that's food or water, you'll have some distension, right? Your stomach's going to stretch out a little bit. And there are nerves in the stomach that you will recognize that your stomach feels physically full. If there's actually food in your stomach, and that moves into the small intestine, and the small intestine and the pancreas starts to release some of those enzymes to digest food at the top of the small intestine, like we talked about last week. It also releases hormones, and some of those hormones travel to the brain and tell your brain, you're not hungry anymore, stop eating. So there are sort of two different ways that your body experiences fullness. And so while water can make you feel physically full in your stomach, it won't trigger that fullness response by the brain. All of the stuff that you're reading about osmoregulation is about finding this balance between ions, all of these electrolytes, and the water that's in your body. So let's take a minute to talk about the chemistry that's happening here. So an ion is charged. Well, that's the definition of an ion, is that it's a charged molecule, so positive or negative. So here's a salt crystal, and salt crystals are made up of charged ions. So there are positively charged sodium ions, and there are negatively charged chloride ions, and they stick together like magnets because they're positively and negatively charged. And that's why you get this nice, pretty little crystal when they're dry. So water also has charge. It has partial charge because the way that oxygen and hydrogen share these electrons and those bonds is really uneven. And so oxygen is a total electron hog. So that means that there's a little bit of negative charge over here and a little bit of positive charge on this side. So whenever something becomes dissolved, what that means is that water has created these hydrogen bonds to charged parts of that substance. So when you drop a salt crystal into water and the salt dissolves, what happens is that those individual crystals come apart, they each get surrounded by water, and now you can't see the salt crystal anymore. It's blended in, it's all mixed in with water. So this also means that when you eat salt, this is what happens, right? And as these molecules then float away, they float away with the water attached. So because this thing has charge, water is going to automatically be attracted to it like a magnet. So both the positive and the negative. So when you have salt, when you consume a lot of salt and it breaks down in your body, it's going to pull water to it. So you didn't just eat a salt crystal, you ate a salt crystal, and then a whole bunch of water came and surrounded that salt crystal and is now together in your abdomen as that salt moves through the body. So this is why salt can make you feel bloated. It's because you're keeping all this extra water around the salt. So counterintuitively, the way to get rid of this feeling is by drinking more water. So as you drink more water, you're going to dilute out all of this extra salt, and that salt will be more effectively released from the body. So as you increase your water intake, you're going to dilute out some of the salt as it enters into the kidneys. You're going to get rid of more of it, and that will bring with it that extra water that it's holding on to when you can finally excrete out the salt. The other thing you can do to make yourself feel a little bit better is to consume a different kind of ion. So if you have something really salty, you've had sodium and you've had chloride. If you use a different kind, if you consume a different kind of ion, it can bind back up some of these things and sort of pull them out of these hydration shells. And it can also just increase the secretion of all ions in the kidney. So if you have more and more ions taken in, it will stimulate more secretion of them. So eating something like a banana that's got lots of potassium that's not going to add to this existing problem can make you feel a little bit better. All right, this is our basic what's happening in the water balance. Why does salt make you feel bad when you need to drink? And I showed you this slide a minute ago that just says, if you're thirsty, you're dehydrated. If you're sweating a lot, and you're thirsty, then you probably also need electrolytes. So there was a lot of conversation in the book, and there was this big question about, are there better options than sugary soft drinks and sports drinks to satisfy your thirst? So people throughout the chapter had all different kinds of ideas and questions. What about vitamin water? What about coconut water? What about electrolyte water? What about this? So what I thought I would do is bring you a bunch of different labels. So these are 5 beverages. And let's see, these 3 are all 8 ounces. These 3 are both larger. I think these were each 16 ounces. So just take a minute and notice what you notice about them. and think about which one you would or would not choose to rehydrate. Okay, so if you're going to rehydrate, you want some electrolytes, right? So if you are thirsty but not sweating, then choosing a drink that doesn't include sodium, that's a good choice. If you are thirsty and sweating, then you need something that has some amount of electrolytes in it, right? So something like, let's see, this one has some electrolytes, this one has electrolytes. All of these have some electrolytes except this one. I think this is the only one that completely lacks electrolytes. E is in fact vitamin water. C is not vitamin water, but it is electrolyte water. C is electrolyte water, and it doesn't have the added sugar. It does have some extra vitamins, so they fortified it with vitamins, but they also have the intentional electrolytes. Whereas this one, they fortified with vitamins, but didn't add the electrolytes. So that's really the difference between those two things. You can also get this vitamin water in sugar-free. So this one contains sugar and it doesn't contain artificial sweeteners, but there are also vitamin waters that are. This is actually why I started this question. I started digging up these nutritional facts because somebody said, what about coconut water? Coconut water is great. And I was like, how different is coconut water than the other things? I think this is coconut water, but it's not. It's Gatorade. This is in fact coconut water. This one is orange juice, and there's your electrolyte water and your vitamin water. So I really just brought this because I thought it would be interesting to see what the similarities and differences are and how sometimes they're really similar, not all that different at all. And also just to point out that just because something is a water or a juice or doesn't mean that it doesn't also have a bunch of sugar or salt in it. And again, like those things are fine. Having a drink with sugar in it is fine in balance, and having drinks with salt in it are important in balance. But it's just that, like, pay attention to what those labels say and don't just think that because you picked up something that said one of these labels that it's you automatically know what it's going to be. Related to this, what happens when you have too much or too little electrolytes? So if you have too much electrolyte, then we sort of get the salty bloating feeling like we talked about before, because again, all of those electrolytes are going to be surrounded by water. So that's one effect of too much electrolytes. For some people, and I think it's largely why sodium has the reputation that it does, because for some people, sodium has a direct connection to blood pressure, like more strongly than just that it might increase blood volume, but that it actually directly relates to blood pressure mechanisms. And there's a genetic component. And I think it's about 30% of folks, when they've done these big surveys and they look at genetic screens and they say, like, what makes someone susceptible to this salt regulated blood pressure? So about 30% of humans will have that reaction, but the other 70% don't. So if you're somebody that ends up having issues with blood pressure as you get older, it's going to be really important for you to figure out, is salt a contributing factor for me or not? And so a lot of times folks will do what's called the DASH diet, which is a low salt diet when they first realize that they're having problems with cardiovascular health. Then they'll see if that changes their blood pressure or not. The other side of that is what happens when you have too few electrolytes. So when you have too few electrolytes, then you end up with a condition like you read about called hyponatremia. So hyponatremia is another word for water intoxication. So hyponatremia happens usually because someone consumes way too much water, so much so that they have diluted out the electrolytes that are present in their blood. So we have this balance inside and outside of our cells that is held at a very specific level for lots of reasons. And the balance of salt inside and outside of the body is regulating the size and shape and volume of your cells in a big way. So we have these little pores on our cells called aquaporins, and their whole job is to let water through. So they don't let other stuff through, they just let water through. So they're responsible for most of the osmosis that happens, because movement of water is osmosis. So if outside of your cell has become really diluted because you put in a whole bunch more water than needed, then the overall concentration of this bright green salts is really low. So if you were to take a blood sample from someone, you would look at them and say, like, oh, your salt level is really low. So when that happens, the impetus to balance out this difference in osmolarity, or the concentration of solutes on either side of the cell, is going to force water inside of the cell. So water is going to move to this area of really high concentration. So we would say that this cell is hypertonic. It's hypertonic to the cell outside because it's got more of these solute molecules than it does outside. You can also say that the fluid outside, the blood, has become hypotonic because it's got too few molecules of solute outside. And so in an effort to balance this back out, water is going to move in. So it's a lot easier to move water across the membrane than it is to move a charged ion. So charged ions have a lot more difficulty getting across. So the thing that tends to move is water. So if water moves into the cell, this cell is going to fill up with water and expand. So that can cause the cell to burst, and that is a very bad thing. On the opposite side, if you have dehydration, then you imagine that this whole scenario is flipped. So now you've got way too little water outside of the cell, more solute outside of the cell, and water is going to leave the cell and the cells are going to shrivel up. So in hyponatremia, this is what happens. You get a bunch of water flowing into cells. In some parts of the body, that's not terribly damaging. So like you have a lot of room on your abdomen for organs to swell because the cells have swelled. Your belly is soft, right? So like your liver can get a little bit bigger without hurting anything. Your brain cannot do that because you have a hard skull around it. So when hyponatremia causes cells in your brain to swell, that means that your brain starts pushing on the inside of your skull, and that causes neurologic disease and damage. And that's what people actually die from, is essentially that they've crushed their brain because their brain swelled and they couldn't expand. This happens in these odd situations like hold your wee for a wee, which hopefully nobody ever does. But when this actually happens most of the time is in athletes, and it's most common in runners. So there was a study, I think this was like 3 years ago, I forgot to write down the year, where they looked at a whole bunch of Boston Marathon runners. And so they had taken blood samples and urine samples of these people that participated in the marathon and volunteered to give their samples. And they looked to see how many of them had hyponatremia. So of the 488 folks that ran the Boston Marathon a few years ago, 63 of them had clinical hyponatremia, and 3 of them were so bad that they were about to collapse. So folks might be walking around not realizing that they're actually really close to this point because the symptoms can come on suddenly at the end. And what they found was that the things that were more likely to cause runners to have hyponatremia is if they were intentionally hydrating. So this means they weren't just taking drinks because they were thirsty. They were taking drinks because they thought they were supposed to take drinks. They had pre-hydrated, they had intentionally drank at every stop, they had consumed water consistently, even if they weren't thirsty. At the end of this race, some of these folks had gained 7 to 10 pounds because they had consumed so much water that they had all of this extra water in their blood. So this is the take-home message is, if you're running a marathon, you need more than just water. So you need to balance out your salt because you're losing salt. And because if you're consuming a whole bunch of water without consuming a whole bunch of salt, then this is where you end up, in this imbalanced situation. And point 2, which is more important, is going back to this very simple thing. If you're thirsty, take a drink. If you're not thirsty, then you don't need to force yourself to drink water. So I brought you just a couple of slides to tell you about what caffeine actually does and how it works to make you feel the way that you do. Like, is some of this placebo? Do we just feel the way we do because we're used to drinking caffeine? So what does caffeine actually do? So we'll learn about this idea of sort of chemical similarity more over the next few weeks. And we talk about enzymes, and we'll talk about how things fit together. But for now, you can see pretty easily that these 2 molecules look a lot alike. So this molecule is caffeine. This molecule is adenosine, and adenosine is a neurotransmitter. So adenosine causes this signal in your brain that reduces brain activity. So when you first wake up, your adenosine levels are super low because you've been sleeping all day. But as you exist in the world awake, your brain is releasing more and more adenosine throughout the day. So as adenosine levels build up, they're reducing brain activity, and that's what makes you sleepy. So caffeine works because it can bind to those same pathways because it looks the same chemically. So if we imagine that there's this little receptor that's sitting on a brain cell, and if adenosine binds, it's going to turn off. Well, caffeine can bind there too because it's shaped the same way, except caffeine doesn't turn it off. So caffeine then takes up that receptor adenosine might be floating around because you've been awake for a long time, but it can't bind to the receptors to make you sleepy. So it's not that caffeine is giving you energy. It's that caffeine is preventing your body from making you sleepy. And so you get this sense that you have more energy. So how does this have anything to do with hydration? So the effects of caffeine depend a whole lot on how often and how much you consume it. So I kind of broke this down into daily caffeine, and I don't drink caffeine daily. So if you're a daily caffeine drinker and you have a reasonable, not more than 3 cups of coffee a day, then you fit into this category. And in that case, your body becomes acclimated to the fact that you're having caffeine around all the time. You actually will have more receptors put on your brain cells because they're used to having so much caffeine around all the time. So the effect of caffeine tends to go down, which is why folks have a tolerance. So if you never have caffeine and you have a cup of coffee, you're going to feel really energized. But if you have caffeine every single day and you have a cup of coffee, you're going to feel, pretty good, but not like totally crazy. The other thing that happens is if you have caffeine every day, the potential diuretic effect of caffeine also you become desensitized to. So it doesn't actually increase urination at all. So there have been lots and lots of studies where they say, you drink water, you drink coffee, how much does this affect urination? And the answer is, if you're a regular coffee drinker, it doesn't. The other thing that's interesting about caffeine, what does it have to do with diabetics? So if daily caffeine consumption actually has been shown to be protective against the development of diabetes. So caffeine has some interaction with insulin levels, and it can help to regulate insulin levels if it's taken all the time. So on the other hand, if you're not someone who drinks caffeine a lot, but you occasionally do, like you're not a caffeine drinker, but you've got an exam, so you're going to chug 2 cups of coffee and try to stay up and study, you're going to feel way more energetic because your body is not used to having that amount of caffeine, and that can cause an increased urination. So that's why folks will say, yeah, but whenever I drink coffee, I have to pee a lot. Well, yeah, if you don't drink coffee a lot and then you do, this will happen. It can also lead to increasing insulin insensitivity, which means that your body is still making insulin, but your cells are not responding to it by taking up glucose, which can cause your blood sugar levels to spike. So again, caffeine every day, not a problem. Not caffeine every day and you're diabetic, then this can be a big problem. The last thing I brought you a few slides that are going to help you think about the lab. This is one of the first images that you're going to find. So if you haven't opened the lab already, this is one of the first things you'll see. And the lab is going to give you a little bit of review, just help you remember what kinds of things are moving. So your book didn't give you this exact information, but it sort of implied this idea that some things can move across membranes and some things can't. And osmosis is water moving across membranes. And when salt levels become imbalanced, that's water that's moving across. And I said earlier that it's way easier to get water to move across a membrane than it is to get an ion. And it has to do with the nature of this membrane. So next week, you're going to learn about the structures of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And you'll learn more about this phospholipid bilayer. But for now, let me tell you that this thing is non-polar. So think of it like oil. So oil and water don't mix, yes? The inside of this layer is non-polar. And so it's difficult for stuff to get through. So things that are small and things that are not charged, so things that are more like oils that don't have charge, can move through a lot easier. So oxygen is a small non-polar molecule. It can easily go through, and that's super important because we need oxygen to be able to enter in and out of all of our cells all the time. Water, we said, has these special channels. So water's got this special pore that like sits in the membrane. So water can also move easily across. The bigger stuff needs help. So we'll talk next week when you see about glucose and sucrose. These are larger molecules, and they're even among the molecules that we're going to look at in terms of nutrients that your body has to take up. These are tiny, but they're still way too big to like wiggle across a membrane. So they also have to have help getting across the membrane. And this last one are ions. So anything that's charged is just going to be repelled from this lipid layer in the middle, because just like oil and water don't mix, charge and oil don't mix. So ions cannot go across without some little carrier molecule like this as well. So things that can't get across easily have to have help. And some things can just move directly through and some things can't. So I answered somebody's question in the text about like, what's the difference between osmosis and diffusion? And osmosis is just a term for when water is the thing that's moving. And diffusion can happen with anything. So diffusion just means that there's a concentrated source of something on one side of the barrier and not so much on the other side, and that the molecules are going to move from an area of high concentration towards an area of low concentration until they sort of reach this equilibrium. After which they're still going to continue to move and bounce back and forth across the membrane, but they'll pretty much be at an equal level because there won't be any impetus pushing them one way or the other. So when something is really small, that can just happen directly across the membrane. When things are bigger, then we have to have these big proteins that sit in the membrane and bring stuff across, or they can't get across at all. And then this is just an example of our water protein again. And sometimes this stuff either requires energy, so there's way more sugar inside of your gut and you need to bring sugar inside of the cells. But so that, oh, sorry, that was a bad example because I went the wrong way. If there's a bunch of stuff inside and not so much outside, and you're trying to shove more in, you're trying to bring more sugar into that space, that's going to require energy because you're forcing more concentration into a space versus allowing something to move from a high concentration to a low. That's not going to require energy. Okay, so all of that to say, stuff moves across membranes depending on how big it is, if it's charged or not, and if it has help to be able to get across. So your lab this week is about osmosis, and you're going to be looking at a model of a cell membrane, and the thing we're going to use is a dialysis membrane. So this is a lab I've done lots of times in person, and you're going to see a video of one of my former students who was doing this lab, and you can see the steps that she's taking. So you're going to follow along with her. You'll see the lab you'll see videos of her doing the lab. You'll get questions about what she's doing. And then at the end, you'll get this data set that comes out of her running this lab. So we're using these membranes called dialysis tubing. Dialysis tubing is exactly what you think it is. It's the same kind of tubing that's used for kidney dialysis because it does some of the same things. It allows some things to flow through and some things not. So a dialysis membrane can allow small ions, it can allow water molecules, but it can't allow something big. So something big like a sugar molecule is not going to be able to go through this membrane, but water can go through the membrane. So that's really important to remember because the model that you're going to be looking at in this lab is going to use water and sugar or sucrose as the fluid inside of a cell. And you're going to see what happens under different conditions about whether that fluid is, about whether sucrose or water are going to move in or out of the cell. So this is towards the end of the lab. So after you've gone through all the videos and you've asked questions about what's moving back and forth, this is where it starts telling you about data analysis. So in your data set, you find 3 trials for each point. So the first point is that you are going to report average data from those trials and not give us data for every single individual tube. So that's the first thing. You can download this data from Blackboard. It is right here. Here we go. Okay, so this is your data, and it says at the top that this is the mass of each bag measured in grams. So you've got 3 different temperatures that these experiments were conducted at, 3 trials for each temperature, and here's your time. So when this says that you're going to create averages, you're going to average across like these 3 things, you're going to average. So next, it's going to ask you this: what moved? Okay, so then this is your goal. You're going to go back and figure out, does the temperature impact the rate of osmosis? So you've got all this data. You're going to see, does the temperature, these 3 temperatures, impact the rate at which stuff moved? So your goal is to create a line graph, and your line graph is going to have the time on the x-axis and the amount of water or material that moved on the y-axis in averages, and you'll have 3 lines. So you'll have 1 line for 4 degrees, 1 line for 23, and 1 line for 37. This is a really important point of the graph, and it is the place where most people mess up and miss points. So I'm going to talk about this for a moment. So you're going to get this data, you're going to have 3 lines, and you're going to graph them. If you'll notice, this data right here, these bags weighed something when they started because they're not empty, right? Like these were bags that were filled with fluid when they started, and they're not all exactly the same. So if you were to graph this data as is, they didn't all start the same. So they're not all going to end the same. And that's what this would look like. So this is what your graph would look like if you just graphed this like this. This makes it really hard to tell which one of these lines has the steepest slope because the lines are starting at different places. So like I can tell this green one is sharper than the orange one because it crosses over it, but otherwise it's hard to tell. So if instead you subtract out this top value from everything and you set this first one to 0, then instead what you're giving is the change in the mass of the bags over time. So instead of just, this is how much the bag weighed over time, this is how much did the bag increase over mass over time. So if this is change, then all your lines are going to start at the 0 line, and then you can really tell which one of these lines actually was the, like, has the steepest slope. So this is what you want to create in your graph. To your actual question that led me to this whole point, which was, what should you title this graph? The change in mass over time is exactly what it is. So you could title this graph and say like the impact of temperature on the change in mass over time. Don't forget to use these graphing tips. When I score your labs, I look through all the, what did I explicitly tell them to do? That they have to create a line graph. Did they create a line graph? Check, you get 2 points for that. I said only show average data. Did they only show average data? Check, you get 2 points for that. So whenever I'm giving you these tips, use all of the tips. The last thing is, I know that not everybody is an Excel master. If this is challenging for you, then I encourage you to go look for some tutorials. I did post one somewhere on here. Ta-da! I posted this one that is how to make a line graph in Google Sheets, since not everybody has Excel. If you're an Excel user, there are lots of tutorials about how to use Excel. But also, if you try to do this and realize that you're stuck and you can't figure something out, just send me an email and I'm happy to meet with you one-on-one and help you work through your graph or help you troubleshoot wherever you get stuck.